today intends to deliberate on this pertinent topic. The flow of the event is as follows. In the inaugural session, welcome remarks will be presented by Additional Secretary, ICWA, Ms. Nutan Kapoor Mahawar. The inaugural session will be immediately followed by Session 1 on Sustainable Development, which will be chaired by Ambassador Manjeev Puri, former ambassador and distinguished fellow TERI. The speaker for the sessions are Mr. Shashi Shekhar Vempati, co-founder Deep Tech for Bharat Foundation, former CEO Prasar Bharati, Dr. Ajay Lele, DTG MP IDSA, Dr. Shelly Kedia, Associate Director, Sustainable Development and Outreach, TERI. Dr. Sabyasachi Shah, unfortunately, will not be able to join us today. So the session second will be on transforming global governance. This will be chaired by Ambassador Asoke Mukerjee, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. The speakers for the sessions are Dr. CSR Murthy, former professor, School of International Studies, JNU. Dr. Murthy will be joining us online. Dr. Rajat Katuria, Dean, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University, and Dr. Archana Negi, Associate Professor, School of International Studies, JNU. Each session will be followed by a discussion, which will be moderated by the chair. Without further ado, I request Additional Secretary ICWA to present the welcome remarks. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to ICWA's Curtain Raiser Seminar on the UN Summit of the Future, which is scheduled to be held on 22nd, 23rd September 2024 in New York, and which Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi is scheduled to address during his forthcoming visit to the US. Friends, we are all aware of the geopolitical shifts currently underway in the world. The international order, the global power structures are set to be revised. We have to give shape to the new world order, the contours of which are yet not clear. Greater clarity requires greater dialogue and enhanced mutual understanding. Turbulent times also call for greater international cooperation. It is in this backdrop that the forthcoming UN Summit of the Future should be seen. The summit is an effort on the part of the UN to use its amazing convening power to bring together the leaders of the world to give a boost to multilateralism, to revive multilateralism, to reinvigorate international cooperation, especially when it comes to safeguarding the interests of the future generations across all areas of the UN system's mandate and work and beyond. Such a high-level focus on the well-being of future generations, of a consciousness on our part and collective will to protect the present and the future is unprecedented. The summit is scheduled to come out with 3 outcome documents which are currently being negotiated: a declaration on future generations, a pact for the future, and a global digital compact. All the 3 documents are timely and call for responsible behavior on the part of the present generation to the best of its ability and understanding amidst all the churning and strife today at global scale to ensure and protect the interests of the present and future generations. The Pact for the Future, a 30-page document, has 5 chapters on 1. Sustainable development and financing for development, 2. International peace and security, 3. Science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation, 4. Youth and future generations, and 5. Transforming global governance. The pact is comprehensive and covers commitments and action points in all areas of UN's work. It renews, updates, and builds upon mandates of all the constituent units of the UN family. The second document, the Declaration on Future Generations, is an aspirational document which seeks to sum up challenges faced by humanity today in its search for solutions for tomorrow. It comprises of guiding principles and commitments. It reaffirms the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the rule of law, and that these would provide the most effective way for lasting peace and security and sustainable development, and for safeguarding the interests of future generations. Importantly, it acknowledges the interconnectedness of past, present, and future, and the need to learn from past achievements and failures. The Declaration on Future Generations talks about intergenerational dialogue, solidarity, justice, and perhaps it also needs to talk about intergenerational interdependence. The declaration needs to be stronger on the role of family as an essential unit of human life, living, and happiness. While it talks of demographic trends, it should express concern at the rising mortality, especially among the youth and children, due to disease or lifestyle causes, as well as strife, conflict, and insecurity. The declaration should express concern at the declining trend in population in some countries. It should recommit countries to cooperate and work towards enhanced maternal and child health care, capacity building, and research in the field of medicine and education for all. Commitments on housing for all too need to strengthen. The last draft of the document that I saw did not have paras on work and livelihood opportunities for all, and trade for the welfare, security, and prosperity for all. Perhaps this merits consideration. The third document, the Global Digital Compact, seeks to build an inclusive, crime-free, terror-free digital space governed by internationally agreed norms. It seeks to tame and harness artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity through greater understanding of the technology and through regulated use. In short, it seeks human control over AI. This may well be the first time that all countries are getting together to agree on some basic principles related to AI. You may say that the loftier the goal, the more difficult it is to attain. However, it may also be said that it is only lofty goals that catch the imagination and effectively orient humanity's mindset, bring focus to the mind, and spur action. The draft Pact for the Future says, and I quote, "Today, we pledge a new beginning in multilateralism." Unquote. This is significant and noteworthy. However, at the same time, we are also conscious that if geopolitical fault lines continue to deepen, enhanced international cooperation underpinned by an effective multilateral dialogue might not happen anytime soon. Yet, we know that the Summit of the Future can be an important beginning, an important milestone, a significant step to renew international cooperation, dialogue, and diplomacy. The world is better off with these commitments for action than without. With these words, I would now like to invite the chair of our first session on sustainable development, Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, former ambassador to Nepal and EU and former DPR of India to UN, and lead climate change negotiator, and presently distinguished fellow TERI, to take over the proceedings.
Madam Additional Secretary, the entire team at ICWA, thank you very much. You know, every time you invite me, and I'm speaking for myself, but I believe I'm speaking for the entire Foreign Service fraternity, you not just honor us, but you recognize us, and we feel very good. So thank you very much for this. The subject of the UN, fine, one has dealt with it for a long time, but it's you which is truly very important. And to sit in this room makes one feel very special. Today for me is in fact a bit super special. And let me tell you two special reasons for that. The first is the presence of my boss, Ambassador Asoke Mukerjee, to be permanent representative when I had a longish spell of 5 years as DPR and we served on the Security Council. Is perhaps not just au fait with the UN, having done it also in Geneva, but also very familiar with the history of how and when and how these things happen. Let me tell you, today or last evening, a lot of focus was, of course, on the GA, but the background to that was the International Court of Justice. The person that you see sitting in the chair of the presidency of the ICJ used to sit around like this on one of the tables with us. So, sir, absolutely honored, delighted that you are here. I'm sorry I won't be there for that session, but I'll say something about that session too. Nutan, Avni, you, Stuti, all of you, isn't it a bit ironic that sustainable development is first and then is global governance later on? But it's not ironic, because at the end of the day, it's the planet, the world, the family, the humanity, which is more important. Of course, the UN is about global governance. It's the power play of nations. Let's be very clear about that. And so, therefore, global governance, if you don't mind, sir, in that sense, is at a lesser order in terms of, our lifestyle, our humanity, and what is good for us, etc. But these certainly are the burning issues of the day and extremely important. The second reason is to see you, Nutan, in the chair at ICWA. I don't know if all of you out here know, but please plug her, not just for the fact that she's your leader today, but for her experiences, an officer who has served with distinction in our mission in Geneva, handled very complex issues at a time when we were not what we were. We were not the largest country in the world. We were not the fifth largest economy, becoming the third largest, and therefore people looking at you. But at times when you had to challenge, get people together to get your viewpoint looked at. And secondly, if I may remind people, the drafter of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Act in India. So please utilize these opportunities. You have outstanding people here in your midst. Nutan, in your opening address, you mentioned several things about this draft which is coming about. I started my career dealing with the UN, negotiating the World Summit outcome document. And on a lighter note, I must tell you, it had some, 300 paragraphs on everything under the sun, but left out completely the most important power play subject of the world, which is called disarmament. There was nothing on it. And it was a conscious decision. You couldn't agree on it. However, it had in its body the only meaningful notes or alternatives on reform of the UN. Never after that, never before that. And we are still running around on that itself. The current thing which the US is talking about is also some kind of a hash around that particular thing. Of course, you can say, what else can you talk about? And where will it go? Again, as I said, it's the power play of nations. That's how 1945 happened. That's how 1919 happened. And that's exactly how things will happen. We are a changed place, and our place in the world has changed. So, Nutan, let me take you back to something that you said. You mentioned 3 different kinds of pacts, and one of them you mentioned was this digital. So to me, digital is actually only the symbol. This is actually about modern technology. What do we do with it? What has been the experience of multilateralism in terms of governance in the area of technology governance in a broader sense, but especially the internet? Much simpler than AI. That's a highly convoluted kind of subject. We don't even know what it will mean, and so on. Nothing. Why? Because the haves don't see any reason for sharing it with you. The only other country which perhaps has abilities in that world is talking to them. And they are talking to each other. Most of the time they're in confrontation, but sometimes they are on the same page. And actually they come on the same page, sometimes at a very low level, as you have seen in the climate negotiations, but others get left out. That includes us, by the way. We have done a great deal of work. That's a different matter. And it is being recognized. But I want to say that it is my considered belief that much of the work on digital is as a result of India and what we did at the G20, getting the world to recognize what we have done in terms of the use of the digital technology for benefit of the people, which is tremendous. Let's remember at 1.4 billion people, we are today the world's largest country. That makes a difference. Perceptionally, it is the most significant difference. Remember in 1945, we were, let me ask you all the question. Which was the largest country in the world in 1945? Answer, sir. USSR. Okay, sir. Anybody else? Young lady? Sir, yeah, obviously population, yeah. UK. Young lady? US. Largest country in the world in 1945. Anyone else? Nobody has any clue. The answer is India. But we were a colonized country at that stage. The Brits let you sit at the table. They wouldn't have let you become a permanent member of the Security Council. How do you think China became a permanent member of the Security Council with veto? There's geopolitics to it. We all know it. And let's not fudge over that. But the explanation in the minds of everybody is what? The haves have 4/5, but 1/5 is for the have-nots. And you guys are represented, isn't it? That's the way. Inclusion is a very important element. Nobody should feel, or nobody should be able to say, I got left out. I got left out, fine, but did we get left out? The answer is no. And that's the logic. Of course, that it was the Republic of China, Taiwan, these are all different elements of how things went. But that's really the thing. That's changed, and so perceptionally we've changed. But our G20 work is the one which, in a sense, underpins what will be achieved. The second thing is, Nutan, you should have told people this. The officer at the UN leading the charge on this is an officer from the Indian Foreign Service, Amandeep Singh Gill. Let's be a little proud about it. He's a friend of ours. He's a friend of hers, friend of Ambassador Mukerjee. Today, Undersecretary General, we have 2 Undersecretary Generals today, but we have somebody who is actually leading the UN's ideas on technology, digital, etc. And so therefore, there's an Indian touch to it in a very interesting manner. I'm saying this to you in-house within ourselves. Take pride. Our ideas and our people are coming to the fore at the global level. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm very happy that the Honorable Prime Minister is going to be there. I wouldn't have imagined that he would not have been there at the summit of the future is us. We are today the largest country in the world, and this matters. We are the 5th largest economy. Even if we sleep, we will become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And Goldman Sachs, etc., who are not necessarily friends of anyone, easily predict that riding purely on globalization, demography, and leadership, we might even become the 2nd largest economy in the world by the year 2075. Do you know what that means? Nobody will not want to listen to you. You matter. And so Prime Minister's presence is extremely important. And it will be a presence which is not just a presence. It will be a presence that will have to be listened to and will be listened to. And so therefore, I have no doubt that he would have gone. But his going there is going to add not just value to that digital space, but to the ideas of India and our role and our willingness to contribute to global good. So, congratulations to ICWA for hosting this. Now, we'll start the session. One person didn't come, and that gave me an opportunity to take advantage of his time. But Shelley, I will ask you to speak on life because you know it as well. Sabyasachi is our co-member of the Habitat Center cohort. So we all know this quite well. You know, why this sustainability and what? I'll tell you my little involvement with this. Of course, I've led these climate negotiations for years on end and so on. But I was the lead negotiator at Rio Plus 20. And when in the middle of the night, a deal was struck, and it wasn't struck on our issues. It was struck on totally extraneous issues. But part of that collateral benefit was that they agreed to the Rio principles being reinstated. And that's how the SDGs got framed the way they are in terms of sustainability and not purely in terms of energy transition, which is what would have happened otherwise. And therefore, we have a vested interest in the matter. Why? Because it's not just that we are becoming the 3rd largest economy. We want to become also one of the more important well-to-do economy. We are not only looking at net zero 2070, we're looking at Viksit Bharat in 2047. And that's what we want to achieve. We want to achieve it in a sustainable manner. And so therefore, we have a vested interest in what we are doing. And this policy space, which is what the UN is all about, is something that we've prided ourselves. We've done reasonably well in terms of securing policy space for India, and our government has worked to utilize the policy space to bring about the changes which take place in India. Look at our revolution in CFL. It's not that the digital, the use of CFLs. Look at e-vehicles, electric vehicles. You will see the change taking place. Look at our investments in green hydrogen. Look at the costs that we brought down in terms of solar energy. These are tectonic and the world is noticing them. We sitting here perhaps don't notice them, but the world notices them. And they turn around and say, you know, you are because you've done it, there's a model. And it's a model that we can use. But let me also stop here now. I'll ask the panelists to speak. The fact is that we're not doing well on the SDG front. What is the number? Some 20 odd. Hardly any SDGs. Which is it? Let me pull out this sheet here. You know, 13% of the SDGs are on target. Can you imagine? We can give COVID as an excuse, but is that the only excuse? No, it isn't. What do we have to do? As this draft says, we need to buck up. We need to recommit ourselves. But is that going to be sufficient? In my opinion, no. You need to do 2-3 things. You need to bring will. So you need to set up infrastructure, the institutional framework to achieve it. Secondly, you need to commit yourself to it in terms of real facts, resources. Do it. Money, technology. Are you doing it? Are you pushing things? India is. We are one of the in the G20, we are the only country which has not only met its Paris commitments, but has raised them. Let's not talk about the Western world. Great Britain found it difficult to stand at the Dubai COP because they had rolled back all their targets. The Germans are restarting their coal power plants. Everybody else is rolling back, and I'm talking about the Europeans who claim to be the leaders in climate and so on. I'm not talking about the United States. The United States, you have an election. You know exactly what one president did only 4 years back or 8 years back. We don't know what he will do in the future. Unlikely that he won't repeat himself. But let me also tell you that the United States didn't join the Kyoto Protocol, not because there was a Republican president, but because there was a Democrat president. And this is despite Al Gore standing up in Kyoto and saying, sign, sign, sign. And then the Senate didn't do it. So let's be a little sanguine about them. We, on the other hand, lead the world, and the world looks to you. And the world knows, because it's not just the energy transition, it's the adaptation side. You've seen the kind of floods, the kind of heat waves, the kind of thing. Who are the guys who are suffering? It's all in the developing world. Of course, California is also on fire, but it's the developing world which takes the challenges, which is why we matter, because we are part of them. Our heart is with them, but more than that, our ground is that. This is our karma bhumi. We face the same music. We tackle it, and others have an idea. That's why our International Solar Alliance has a special place in this. That's why something which we don't talk about much, but which is fantastic, located right next to you here, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, particularly important for everybody. And that's the nature of all this. So I'll stop here and encourage you all to take lots of questions. So we have 3 people who are going to speak to us today. We'll have Mr. Shashi Shekhar Vempati. All of you know him in his previous avatar as the person who led communications as far as India is concerned, the CEO of Prasar Bharati. But right now, he's involved with technology, and technology for the benefit of everyone. So we'll hear you, Shashi. Look forward to that. We have Group Captain Ajay Lele from MP IDSA, who's going to talk to us about other elements of sustainability, all of which also have a certain bearing. You know, securitization is the new buzzword for everything. But let's hear from someone like him who brings that particular element into the need as to how this is extremely important and so on. And then we have my dear colleague from TERI, Shelly Kedia, who leads us in several areas in TERI, including on the organization of the World Sustainable Development Summit. She has a PowerPoint presentation, rather worth seeing what has happened on the SDG front. And one of the very specific suggestions, can we do more coherence? So I'll stop now. Shashi, the floor is entirely yours. How many minutes, Avani, can we? 10 minutes, sir. That's it. You said so. 10, Shashi. I am the only guy who has the liberty to go on and on.
That was a fantastic introduction. Thank you. Very happy to be here. And thank you to ICWA for the invitation. So I'm coming to this conversation as an outsider because I don't really understand the world of multilateral negotiations and so on. So bear with some of my perspective. It may lack on that dimension. But I think it's very interesting that the Summit of the Future is happening, and technology from the point of view of sustainability is being debated. I think it would be an understatement to say that we are living in a time of immense technological change. Just the last couple of days, I think, witness to that. At one end of the spectrum, just this morning, I was reading news that there's a new AI model, which is voice to voice and optimized for mobile devices. So that's like, bringing the whole power of, generative AI to your handset. At the other end of the spectrum, we just saw what happened with mobile devices in Lebanon, where they just got weaponized. So I think it just tells us that technology is changing so fast, and at two extreme ends of the spectrum, technology that we use every day in our lives, in our hands, is shaping the world. And I think it's so it makes it all the more important for technology to be at the heart of this discourse and conversation. Artificial intelligence, which is what I'm going to largely focus on today, is at, I think, a very important inflection point. We saw what happened with ChatGPT over the last 2 years, but the most recent model that was released by OpenAI, the O1 model, I think in many ways encapsulates what we are discussing today. Because today you are at the cusp of being able to mimic human reasoning. And I actually played with this new model, so I have a first-hand experience of it. So my younger son is into Olympiads and he's a linguistics enthusiast. So I asked him, why don't you share with me some problems that I can give this ChatGPT? So he shared with me a couple of linguistics problems in the most recent Olympiad. And so we gave it 4 problems, and it was able to solve 2 of them, which is pretty good at that level of reasoning. And so today, intelligence has reached that level where it's almost at a master's student or a PhD student level of intelligence within a machine. And I think that's a very important milestone that we're seeing with AI. Now, of course, the question is at what cost? And I think that is where the sustainability angle also comes in. Because these models come with a significant environmental cost because they need significant computing power in the cloud with the data centers, and that has an implication for the environment. There's a study by the Columbia University where they looked at what is the power demand of these large language models, what makes them such substantial power guzzlers. Especially the ones which have billions of tokens as part of the modeling. And they project that by 2027, 2030, almost 30% of the new power demand will be taken up by AI and GPUs. And I think that's significant. So their estimate is almost 14 gigawatts of additional new power capacity will be required. Now, there's another aspect to this. The cost on a per million token basis has steadily come down. So it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to use these models. So while the impact on power grids may not yet be on such a scale, if you look at an economy like the US, what about an economy like India, right? Let's say AI usage takes off in a big way across the 1.4 billion people, then you're looking at, and as it becomes cheaper and cheaper to use, more people will use it, and hence you'll have far more demand on your power grids. So there is a big question there in terms of, is this a sustainable way to use AI? And what is the way forward for India? Because right now, the model for AI development is largely what has emerged from the Anglosphere, right? And where their focus has largely been on content which is available on the public internet. And their whole approach has been based on their needs and their use cases. While our needs may be very different. We are a far more diverse society, much more extremities in terms of socioeconomic demographics. So our path has got to be different. And I think you alluded to that, especially in the context of G20 and what we shared with the world in terms of our digital public infrastructure. So the way our approach has been to the digital economy, I think has been quite different. We have been very, very different from the rest of the world. One statistic, which I think again has an implication from a sustainability standpoint, is how we consume mobile data. I think right now we are perhaps past the 20 GB per month rate, and soon I think we'll probably hit 30 or 50, even 50 gigabytes on an average per month in terms of data consumption. And this is all predominantly video consumption. But just think of what it takes to generate this kind of video in terms of cloud capacity in the data centers, the content delivery network, and more importantly, to sustain it at these speeds, you're going to have to put 5G, 4G networks at a very dense manner in the urban environment. And that's, again, going to come with a significant environmental cost. Similarly, with digital payments, again, our approach has been very different from the West. We have taken to mobile payments in a big way, clocking billions of transactions. So all of these have implications from the point of view of how will we approach AI adoption. And my hypothesis is that we will see very uniquely Indian use cases and patterns of adoption, which may result in unique challenges from a sustainability standpoint. So we'll have to take a different path. We can't just take the same path that the West has taken, which raises the question of how do we go about indigenous development of AI, and what does it mean for sustainability? The issue in the AI era is not so much about digital access alone, because in the internet era, it was all about how do we bring digital access to everyone? How do we make sure that even the marginalized parts of the country, the remote areas, they all have digital access? Once you come to the AI era, it goes beyond that, because it is now about knowledge, about access to knowledge. And how do we ensure that every region, every language, every culture is empowered to participate in this digital knowledge economy, right? And the challenge with the current approach that the large language models have taken is they have scraped content of the public internet and have built these models. Now, that also raises certain ethical issues. If they were very ethical in the way they did it, because I'm pretty sure most of them violated copyright norms. They took content that we didn't give permission to them to train their models. But that is one aspect on the ethical side. I think the bigger aspect, which I think, especially from an Indian context standpoint, is important, is that the diversity of languages and the knowledge base within these languages, I think that has been lost because many of these languages don't exist, don't have enough content on the internet. They don't have large knowledge bases available, digitized on the internet. And worse, I think, is the risk of biases, inherent biases. And we've seen this with the large language models, that a lot of the cultural context is lost when you just scrape content of the internet. And you end up with building these models with knowledge where you have lost the local sensitivities, the local nuances, and that's a big risk, especially in a diverse society like India. Right. So how do we overcome this? How do we encourage indigenous model development? And I think this is not just true of India, it will be true of many other societies which have a lot of diversity and are not that digitally enabled. So one of the challenges in India has been, of course, the lack of computing power. We were far behind on the GPU front. Only now the government is pushing the private sector to come together and create a pool of GPUs that can be made available to our researchers, our startups. So that's, I think, work in progress. But there's also another big challenge, which is the lack of publicly accessible data sets. Because if you have to build a model on the different languages of India, the different dialects of India, different parts of India, and if you want to reflect that entire diversity, you need publicly accessible data sets to train these models. And I think that is a big challenge in India right now. So one of the things, one of the ideas to overcome this, which again may be relevant even in the global context, is can we have a campaign or a movement around donating data? So we're calling it Data Daan. the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, they have an initiative called Bhashini, which is around Indian languages. They call it Bhasha Dan. Basically, the idea is the same thing, that can we motivate people to donate data? And the genesis of this goes back to something that I was involved with when I was the CEO of Prasar Bharati. As you know, All India Radio and Doordarshan are holding a living memory of Indian history. And especially in the context of Akashvani, it has content in more than 100 Indian languages and dialects. So it's a very rich repository. And that's a strategic national asset. So what we did was, we took a decision that we'll make this archive available to IIT Kanpur to do AI development. So part of the thinking behind this data done is, from this idea. Similarly, can we look at enabling skills so that, you brought up the aspect of livelihoods. So how do we, enable people from a skilling and livelihood standpoint in the context of AI? So there are some ideas there around, can we create people with, polymathic skills who can be effective and competitive in this era of AI. So these are some ideas in terms of how we can do, sustainability in this, era of AI and technology. I think will require very uniquely Indian approaches and challenges.
Shashi, thank you very much. Thank you for sticking to the time. I'll just leave a question in your mind and come back to you. What we are doing is by example, which is great. But the world also perhaps needs some kind of, I won't say international law, but some kind of, global understanding on control, regulation, whatever. The world has shied away from all that. I would like to hear at some stage your perspective on what should be our view on that. So let me stop there. Dr. Lele, the floor is yours. The presentation.
Well, before the presentation gets loaded, thank you so much. Let me thank ICWA. I could meet some of old friends over here who are from IDSA. So I knew about you as a tough negotiator, but just now I saw you're a tough chair also. So I got a slightly longish presentation. I'll try to restrict to the time, maybe 1 or 2 minutes here and there. Well.
Can someone just help Dr. Lee? Just go.
No,
Run this show.
Depend.
Oh, can I sit there and do it?
No, you please sit here. He'll come here.
Depend इनका help कर.
Jani.
So he'll take care of it. He knows how
to. You start with the first slide. You got to slightly, because there are many slides, so you got to be slightly smart. There's Manohar Parikar. It has been fund. That is Manohar Parikar ideas. Yeah, no, it is Manohar Parikar and ideas. Yeah, so I'm going to talk of technology as a key for sustainable development. Next slide.
Next.
Dr. Eli, can you just say it by yourself?
Yeah, no.
Because I think he's not getting it.
Okay.
Yeah,
when we are talking of a technology, it is just a use of scientific knowledge. You keep on changing the slides.
The picture is not working.
Or can I stand there and do it?
Yeah.
Exactly, that will be easier. Talking of digital technology, so it happens. When I'm talking of a technology today, oh, my slide is not there. वहाँ पे नहीं आ रही. हाँ, delay. Okay. That slide is delay नहीं. Okay, when I'm talking of a technology today, essentially what it means is about we are using certain types of technologies. However, what happens is that as far as the slide which should come over there, the slide is showing a person in the wood trying to cut the trees by using a hacksaw, which is powered by a solar battery. So at one end, you are using the technology, but at other end, you are using the technology for things which are actually not conducive as far as your assessment is concerned. When we are talking of dynamics of technology, I think there are various nomenclatures which are there. There could be devices, there could be inventions, there could be mechanisms, so on and so forth. So when we are talking of a technology, it is all pervasive. As far as technology aspects are concerned, I think one can say that sustainability couldn't be achieved at an individual level, at organizational level, at national level, and a global level. At an individual level, a simple thing is that we can have sensors as far as water management is concerned. Organizational level, you can have some sort of solar plants. At a national level, you can have definitely certain amount of policies, EV and other structures. Global level, you all know about climate change debate. So as far as technology sustenance is concerned, environmental, social, and economic sustainability factors are very important. We all know that solar, rainwater harvesting, carbon capture, EVs are various technologies. Right now, already people have spoken about AI. I'll not spend time on that and skip those slides. As far as key development devices which are there or drivers as far as the technology enabler goals are concerned, there could be 5 to 6 which are the enabler goals. But actually what people are working on as far as sustainability is concerned from a technological perspective in the industry is they're working from your raw material till the final product is created. So a lot of your value chains and service chains and other ecosystems have got certain amount of a technological investments into them. As far as AI solutions are concerned, they are always there in climate change, environmental policy, renewable energy, waste management, so on and so forth. AI, I'm not going to spend much time again, but one thing which I would like to mention over here is that we are talking of AI in a big way for sustenance, but at the same time, there is an ongoing debate on lethal autonomous weapon systems or what we call killer robots. And this is where the dichotomy comes in, that AI has got a tremendous amount of utility for sustainability, but at the same time, there is a huge amount of a military infrastructure which is associated with. We are seeing in ongoing wars also. Yesterday, when somebody is using certain amount of technologies for creating problems in pages and all that, definitely one has to look at AI from that perspective also. In fact, unfortunately, the slide is not coming. I have made a case study over here as far as space is the concern. You all understand that outer space, our satellite systems is a reality as far as present day world is concerned, and we are tremendously depending on them as far as satellite systems are concerned. So there is a need to have the entire satellite architecture at the backdrop of sustainability development. I'm sure you all understand the terminologies like global commons, common heritage to mankind, so on and so forth. And these technologies play a very major role when we are talking, or these terminologies play a major role when we are talking of a global heritage and as far as common heritage to mankind. But there are certain amount of issues where the world is not in agreement to consider outer space domain as a common heritage to mankind. And that's where the challenges to sustainability are coming. If you look at the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, since 2019 onwards, they are keenly involved into space sustainable development. They are making investments into Earth observation satellites, satellite communication, satellite positioning as key technologies for achieving SDGs. Weather forecasting, remote sensing, global positioning systems, communication systems, astronomy, all these things are directly or indirectly related with achieving the sustainability, and that is where the key of space technologies lies in. If you see as far as space is concerned, from science to technology to data, everywhere it is always involved into it. So there is a sustainable development goals which are associated with space, and UN Office of Disarmament, and particularly the UN office, which is looking at it at outer space age issues. They are already identified all the 17 technology goals which are there, all the 17 sustainable development goals which are there. They are already identified one by one. I'll just pick up something over here for the sake of example. Say goal number say 14, where we are talking of underwater developments. Here also space technologies play a very important role because sea surface temperature and fishing activities and various other activities associated with come with a forecast which are being issued by using satellite technologies. So people are looking at satellite technologies from the perspective of a sustainable development. Along with the European Space Agency, United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs has come out with a web portal, and there is a tremendous amount of data which is available. You can visit that portal. There's a good amount of data. So that data could be used very effectively for the technology, very effectively for various aspects, like from say food security to natural resources management to health management. You all know that countries like India are deeply involved into telemedicine, disaster management, and there are certain programs about poverty related issues also, which are directly or indirectly connected with space technologies. Now they have identified particularly Earth observation satellites and global positioning system as the two main component to achieve the goals of SDGs. Satellite communication, space science, space exploration, technology transfer, all are considered as major goals. By 2030, the end of hunger and ensure access to all people for particularly infants, safe and affordable nutrition is one of the key goals. And this is where the United Nations is continuously pushing that space is going to play a very important role, because as far as space is concerned, it could help you as far as precision agriculture and other farming related issues also. But at the same time, there are various major issues as far as sustainability of space is concerned. There is an orbital overcrowding which is happening. Space debris is one of the issue. Management of storms. I'm sure you must have read in papers a couple of years back that Elon Musk has lost his 40 satellites because of the solar storms only. India has recently launched a satellite called Aditya L1 that itself proves that we're also looking at it very seriously to understand what is happening as far as space weather is concerned. If you see the crowding of the orbits, I will give you one data that say by 2025, you hardly had any satellites. But today you have got more than 10,000 satellites, and most of them belong to the Elon Musk constellation. More than 6,000 satellites are there. So there is a significant amount of a crowding of a data is there, and that leads to your space situation awareness, space debris management, and other related issues. So what I will say is that space tourism is again a very interesting area where there is a certain amount of an issue as far as management of SD related aspects are concerned, but people are still working towards it. Then there is a misconduct which is happening in the space. You all understand anti-satellite missions, basically issues related with on-orbit servicing, then space traffic management, so on and so forth. So we are looking at a cosmos as a next level where the humanity wants to shift or at least operate into it. And we need to take those things very seriously. The nature of a warfare over a period of time has evolved, and everywhere the technology is the problem. So in the end, I will say that we need to look at a concept of the power of and, where responsible behavior without any trade-off should be considered. Technology holds immense potential for all these aspects. Technological advancements provide powerful mechanisms to help to meet sustainability goals. But we need to also remember that technology could be both boon and bane. Thank you so much.
Dr. Lele, thank you. That was particularly interesting because you focused on things that we see, read, but don't focus on. Thank you very much. You know, I'll just say this to you. Technology, the human mind, what it will come up with, of course, we created the problem, we'll find the solution, one way or the other. But the United Nations and global governance are really not about that. If you look at WHO, FAO, etc., there have been some little aspects of global cooperation on development, CGIAR in agriculture, the Green Revolution in India, etc., but generally not. These agencies and these global governance patterns are about regulation without manna falling from heaven, without Louis Pasteur discovering pasteurization or the inoculation being discovered, etc. That's a different template. Those need to be encouraged. But the big ball game, fortunately, unfortunately, is regulation, and it's a power game of nations. I'm going to turn to Shelly Kedia, who will talk to you about things which are germane for the United Nations today, which are really in the area of energy transition and many other things. So Shelly, I think you should go there and do exactly what Dr. Lele did, which is don't wait for it to run. It's not running. So click yourself onto it. Thank you. This was fabulous. And you drew our attention to something which we think is very nice. Badhiya, ye kagaz mein padho. But Fabulous. Thank you.
So I just hope I'm audible. So it's not projected yet. Okay. So thanks a lot to ICWA for giving this opportunity and for deliberating on this very important topic of sustainable development as well as global governance ahead of Summit of the Future. So if we look at Summit of the Future, as was already highlighted in the introductory address, we are looking at 3 outcome documents: Pact for Future, Declaration on Future Generations, as well as the Global Digital Compact. So if we just look at the Pact for Future and the latest draft that is out there are 58 actions, as if 169 targets of the SDGs were not enough. And a lot of them really in many ways are repeating what is already there in the SDGs. Out of 58 actions, 6 actions are on climate change, 23 actions are on sustainable development or SDGs. And out of these 6 actions on climate change, I mean, 5 of them do have synergistic reference to between climate change and sustainable development. If we look at the original SHAPO, the original zero draft, it had sustainable development and financing for development as the key themes. So just taking the entry point of SDG climate synergies and how our multilateral systems have evolved, and what is the state of play and what can be done to ensure greater coherence, because a lot of the focus is about multilateralism, and one of the important aspect is ensuring greater coherence in the multilateral systems. And I'll be taking SDG climate synergies as one of the examples. So first is a time for reality check. If we look at the 169 targets of SDGs, only 14% targets are on track. In fact, this year, while measuring the SDG progress report, a new category was introduced called as regression. Means these are the SDGs which have actually gone back. They have actually instead of progressing, they are actually regressing. So 14% of SDGs are actually regressed. So imagine this being adopted in 2015, and a lot of them, these relate to, like education, gender, these very important social issues. So that is a very worrying picture. Also, 1/5 of them are not even tracked. There is no data to track them. We are talking so much about AI, digital revolution, but 20% of them, of the SDGs, are not even tracked. How does one inform policy action? And both goal 1 and goal 13, which is on climate action, are off track. I mean, goal 1 is a very basic poverty eradication, sustainable development in the context of poverty eradication. It's the basic. What we are also seeing is a growing gap in terms of financing SDGs, which actually grew from 2.5 trillion, which was in the pre-COVID time, to 4 trillion annually now. So that's a huge gap that we're talking about. And all throughout this discussion, like, there is no reference to that only 5 countries were even able to meet their ODA commitments. Yes, of course, that is not a lot of money. ODA is never a lot of money, but it is a very important plank for trust, between developed and developing countries. Also on the climate front, if we look at the latest global stocktake report that was launched at Dubai in COP28 last year, it calls for 43% emissions to be reduced by 2030, whereas the current commitments put it only on a track to reduce it, and that to be fully implemented by 2%. So there is a huge gap. So why SDG climate synergies? Very briefly, there is evidence that 80% of SDG targets are linked to climate action. And 70% of that is linked to adaptation, climate adaptation. And yet in the global negotiations, adaptation is not necessarily at the forefront. And also, on the other way around, there are trade-offs. If we only focus on climate action, especially on climate mitigation, it could put 84 billion 84 million people at the risk of hunger. So it's not important. It's also very important to not only paint a rosy picture of SDG climate synergies, but also look at the trade-offs. In terms of the evolution of multilateral processes, um, we know that it's actually on the next slide, which is still loading, but we know that it has common origins. You know, the UNFCCC was open for signature at the Rio Summit, 1992. For the SDGs, 92 saw the adoption of Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration, and then it moved on to the Millennium Declaration and then leading to the MDGs, and then that eventually leading to the adoption of the Agenda 2013 SDGs in 2015 on climate action also. Similar to these years, there were significant milestones, including UNFCCC opening for signature in 1992, to the adoption of, to 97, of course, very important Kyoto Protocol, and then a new model, which is like more like bottom-up and pledge-based in 2015 through the adoption of Paris Agreement. However, these multilateral processes have actually grown apart from each other more and more. I mean, and I think like this is one area where actually it might have negative implications on the social goals, both in terms of synergies and trade-offs. But at the multilateral system, what we see is in 2019, the UN DESA, which is part of the UN Secretariat and UNFCCC Secretariat, they served as co-conveners to launch something called as the Climate Action and SDG Synergies Platform. Apart from the UN system, the G20, the UNAR, the G7, they've all been calling out for integrated action and a greater synergies between SDGs and climate change. And at the moment, the synergies platform is at an initial stage, more at a UN level, more expert driven, not so much at a country political level. So, but it is focusing on norm advancement, knowledge creation, and socialization through conferences, and not just at the UN, but like I mentioned, also through the G20 and G7. So what is the reason for this fragmentation? I mean, we can keep talking about multilateralism and reforms, and yet there isn't that coherence in the multilateral system itself. Of course, one is regime complexity, or both UNFCCC and sustainable development, with the latest being HLPF, which built over the Commission on Sustainable Development. They have a basis of different rules, processes. UNFCCC, of course, having a greater legal teeth over SDGs, wherein even the reporting remains voluntary. It's called VNRs because its reporting is voluntary. Also, of course, it's distinct in its multilateral leadership, COPs led by the UNFCCC Secretariat, but more importantly, the COP presidency. In every COP president comes with their own mandate and agenda. And SDG process is, of course, coordinated largely by UNDESA, which is based out of the UN headquarters, and to some extent, of course, with ECOSOC involvement. Now, if we also, the aspect of multi-level governance is not just at the multilateral level, but at the national level also the agencies differ. For example, in SDGs, it's Niti Aayog in India, and for climate, it is MOEFCC. And when you go further down at the subnational level, there again, there is a mismatch, and somewhere the decision making and policy making is taking place in silo. If we look at the global discussion now, this is based on the analysis of statements submitted by different countries ahead of HLPF, because this HLPF also saw, so every HLPF sees reviews of individual SDGs. So this HLPF also saw the review of SDG 13, which is on climate action. So one of the things where we do see a divergence, of course, there's a consensus that there is an indivisibility when it comes to SDGs. There has to be a coherent approach, etc. But nevertheless, when we talk about general positions of developed versus developing countries do emphasize more on balance between the three pillars of sustainable development, wherein like developed countries, they emphasize more on synergy. So developing balanced and developed is on synergies. So what we also see from the statements is that power relations do underline this very narrative of SDG climate synergies, wherein developed countries are very optimistic about the interconnectedness without taking into account the trade-offs also that might be involved. So that is an important part. now coming to the final as to like how do we go about this. So one is that we have to buttress. There is a lot of. It's not as if there aren't discussions around coherence or synergies, but we have to buttress the UN and expert mandates with political mandates, and ownership has to be taken by member states, and there has to be lighthouse initiatives for member states that are enabling a greater coherence between different issue areas, including recognizing synergies and trade-offs between different issue areas. Considering the significance of SDG 13 and climate action, this is something which can be reviewed annually along with SDG 17, which is focused more on the partnerships and means of implementation. And of course, at the national level, there is need for enhanced coordination. So, I mean, having said that, you know, the Pact for Future with its latest document really does not come up with any concrete proposals. In fact, Ambassador Puri, you mentioned you were part of Rio Plus 20 and you were leading. And that time, there were two main key themes: green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and the other was institutional framework for sustainable development. In fact, there were more creative proposals as a part of the institutional framework for sustainable development, but I don't see that happening in the current Summit for Future. I can talk about life, which Sabya was supposed to talk, but maybe later. Yeah.
Yeah, do speak for one thing.
Okay.
Just in there,
Okay, sure.
something very important here, because you are in process. So Sherry, just mention life to people, just one, in a few lines, because otherwise we would have missed out on India's sort of, in a sense, flagship initiative.
Yeah, so in many ways, of course, sustainable lifestyles is not new to the discussions, but yes, India has been very instrumental in ensuring that it is recognized in the preamble of the Paris Agreement along with climate justice. And also, of course, at COP26 at Glasgow, the Prime Minister of India, Honorable Mr. Modi, he did announce the Mission Life initiative, the Lifestyles for Environment initiative. And it, of course, became one of the key concepts based, for India's G20 presidency as well. And eventually, just very recently, also led to a UN Environment Assembly resolution in the work which we've been doing with TERI, and also, as a part of Think 20 task force of G20, we have been advocating that India should play a normative leadership and advocate more internationalizing of life, including to the UN General Assembly. So, again, the individual consumers, it's not adequately recognized, not in the Sustainable Development Goals indicator frameworks with its 169 targets, and not certainly also in the Pact for Future. So if Sabya would have been there, he would have certainly advocated for life economy. So entire economic sectors, livelihood sectors built around sustainable lifestyles. So yeah, I think I just stop at that.
Sherry, thank you very much for this. This was important. Can I ask you, in your presentation, just go back to one of the slides. I want to draw everyone's attention. We have 5 minutes. I want you all to think as students of international relations and even practitioners. Sherry, go back to your slides, your slideshow. And the one which is the divergence. I want to draw people's attention to why that happened and what happened. I don't know what this is. So we get it quickly. Yeah, just go on further. No, go behind this. Yeah, the one before this. One before this. Little before. Yeah. I say, I want you all to look at this. And I want to tell you that both Ambassador Mukerjee and I were perhaps responsible for this triangle being formed, and not Shelley as what you advocated. You are a climate activist, environmentalist, and you have every right to do what you're doing. But we all come from fundamentally one area, which is India and global governance and going up. And why do you think it is like this? I want to tell you, had it not been for a great deal of effort on India's part, and I'm saying so measuredly, the SDGs would have meant 1. Do you know that climate right now is 13? Essentially, climate is energy transition. Nobody is interested in adaptation. Poverty, alleviation, and hunger would have been disappeared because they simply said it's over and out. This is the nature of the game. And which is why and shall we take you on to the next slide where you mentioned synergies and balance. Again, I want you all to note words matter, and these are words which are carefully chosen and important in the context of this. Maybe you should ask your own acting director general to talk to you about these things. Why you would say the word synergy, such a nice word. Of course, it's a nice word. But what is it that you are talking about synergies? You're talking about synergies for doing something which is fine at your end, at your level of consumption, your level of production. Here, we are 143 out of 193 in terms of per capita income, among the lowest in terms of not just our carbon footprint, but electricity consumption, in terms of every single element of what we are saying. This is not just India. Think about African countries. Think about so many other countries. And you are wanting to forget the balance between economic, social, and the environmental dimension. India has been a champion, a leader, trying to do all three. Many others find that very difficult. And therefore, these words matter. These words are critical, and they are perhaps the crux of what is being discussed at this particular moment. The other things are good. You must encourage it. The UN, etc., have limited abilities to be able to do it. Governments themselves have limited things. That ChatGPT was not produced by a government. A government may have helped and produce money. That's a different matter altogether. But that's the nature of these particular things. So it's regulation. And that's what I want you all to focus your mind on. Let's take a few questions. And come on, please, there must be questions. We'll give ourselves exactly 5 minutes to 11:50. That is eating up into 5 minutes of tea time. And if you don't ask questions, I will ask you questions. Yes, young lady, I'm so happy.
Thank you, sir. My question is to the Yes, sir. So we are now talking about the Summit of the Future. So how can the Summit of the Future, aiming to strengthen the global governance for the present and the future generations, can boost the existing or implementation of the existing SDGs or SDG goals or 2030 SDG agendas in this complex geopolitical landscape? Because there are a lot of given all the developments in the world right now. So how can the Summit of the Future can really help in boosting the implementation of the existing mechanisms which are already here?
Let's take one other question. Excellent question. I'm so glad Lady died.
Thank you, sir. So my question is to Dr. Shally. So what should be the immediate next steps post Summit of the Future? And how can the commitments under the Pact of the Future be effectively implemented in the turbulent world order? And so I also have a question to Mr. Vempati. So you were saying that demand on energy would increase with the scientific and technological advancement that we are seeing. So how do we see how are we going to fulfill it? Will green energy, green hydrogen be a solution to it, or are we also looking at nuclear? Because I think we are also looking at the at crossing over the problems that we had with using nuclear energy now. Gulf countries are also looking at investing in nuclear energy with other countries. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. So we take 2 other questions. Right? Because otherwise there's no time to answer. Young man there. My question is, rather than this question, business budget implement allocated some money for small water reactors. Given the complexity and entire politics where nuclear energy can how far you think sustainability and green future will be calculated the answer of policy? Thank you. An excellent again and very proper answer. Sir, you and then that.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
I have a simple question to Ambassador Puri. What will be likely takeaway from the Summit of the Future, especially for India? Like we do such kind of summits always in UN, but implications are least. So I would specifically like to understand.
Sir.
So my question is carrying forward to the question on nuclear energy politics, and you have highlighted about the importance of linkages between arms control and climate in politics. And currently we are at the stage where arms control thing is going down. So can we see any future impact on future negotiations as far as COPs are concerned? Because I believe both things are interlinked. Thank you.
Very briefly.
So,
Yeah.
may I add in a question for?
certainly, how can we say no? Otherwise, child is like.
So my question is to Dr. Ajay Lele. So harnessing the benefits of technological innovation and digital and emerging technologies such as AI and bridging the digital divide, is how can the development, deployment, and sustainable utilization of emerging technologies be de-risked and focus on their potential for the progress of the people and the planet? Because that's the most de-risking them has become the main criteria, because emerging technologies are they speedily coming into our environment, and how do we de-risk them is the main question. So.
Anni, thank you very much. Extremely important. It's a word we use in several contexts, but I will leave it to Dr. Lele. Shashiji.
Yeah. So I'm not an energy expert, so I can't really answer whether. Yeah. So my sense is that while we figure out which whether it's green energy or nuclear energy, we also have to figure out unique ways of using AI, where maybe we don't rely so much on large language models. We focus on small language models, less on cloud computing, more on on-device computing at the edge. So all of these different approaches, which are very uniquely Indian, could make a difference and help with sustainability while we figure out the bigger question on energy. You had a point on regulation. I think it is very important, especially on the ethics side and on the risk side. And I don't think any one country has figured it out. We will have to come together. It has to be a multilateral thing, and it'll take us some time, because the thing about AI, especially where it is today with neural networks, is we don't even understand how they work. So how do you regulate something that you don't even understand how it works?
Shashi, extremely important, but karna to kuch padega. It takes very long time. Dr. Lele.
Thank you. Just before that, one suggestion as far as energy is concerned, you got a concept of a space-based solar power, which many countries are now working on it. It's a very costly affair, but yes, ISRO has also started working on it. As far as de-risking is concerned, you see, this is a basically concept which has come into being last 3-4 years back. And since it is a US concept, everybody's picking on it. So I personally don't feel so that we should get carried away by these types of nomenclatures and putting things into a particular basket. But as far as technology is concerned, as I ended my presentation, it is both boon and bane. That's why I gave an example of artificial intelligence as well as the lethal autonomous weapon systems. So we got to live with it, because every technology will give certain amount of advantages. At the same time, every technology will have its own pluses, minuses. When plastics came into being, it was supposed to be most amazing technology. But now today we know, as far as climate change is concerned, how challenging it is. So there are various technologies which are coming up, which are coming as an alternative to existing technologies also. Quantum technology is one technology which could become an alternative to your existing cyber domain also. May not happen in near future, but that's the way people are looking at it. So now people are basically concentrating on ensuring that they will have a stronghold as far as technology is concerned, and they are not going to let it down. So as far as technology is concerned, power politics will always play.
Thank you. Perfectly well said. And thank you for using the words which we all know, don't want to say. Shelley.
Yes, so on the question of what would be the immediate next steps after the summit and how does one implement? I mean, I guess like the summit is also just a way to ensure that, that the agendas of SDGs and the latest development around digital and technology, it's high on political agendas of each country. So of course, on one hand, it will just be more like a show of solidarity and, reaffirmations. I don't think so there is going to be any very great concrete outcome. And as it is, the multilateral system has evolved. Every specific issue will have their own space for negotiation, and their upcoming one really, and everyone's, at least like in the community, Ambassador Puri called me a climate activist, is going to be on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is going to be upcoming in Baku in November. And we do hope to see like a more ambitious outcome from the floor of $100 billion. Hopefully, when India has asked for 1 trillion, the African group of negotiators has asked for 1.3 trillion. So I think that's going to be like really like next step. In terms of implementation, I think countries will have to come back and look at the state of SDGs. But I also do hope that there is recognition that even the very basic, and it's just an element of trust. ODA, of course, it's not that a country like India with like this, huge potential for growth, markets, etc., is like really looking at ODA, but it's still a small token of trust. So I do think like it is more about coming back to your countries and ensuring that whatever you can do to accelerate SDGs, climate action, and the other topics that will be discussed. But of course, the challenging geopolitical context stays, and of course, the implementation for some countries will definitely be impacted because of that. Yeah.
Sherry, thank you very much. Avni, will we still get tea, or do we put an end to this right now?
Definitely.
You will. ठीक है. Nutan also says yes. तो चलेगा. You know, Shelly prepared for me a chart yesterday. And Shelly, I'm very happy that between yesterday and today, 1% more SDGs have become on track. It was 13% yesterday, it's 14% today. And that's because she simply used more updated data. Bottom line, we're not on track. Let's understand that. Why is it happening? Because actually there's very little commitment other than a country like India, which is committing itself heart, soul, mind, and resources. The Western world is looking here and there. The Europeans today have the greatest excuse, the Ukraine-Russia war. The US, in any case, said, first US, then we look at anybody else. The Chinese actually, surprisingly, are doing much of this, but they're leading in so many other worlds, the people don't want to look at them. So that's the nature of this. Panikkar Sahab, let me try to answer your question. And nuclear. Look, in the mahal in which we are all very excited. Nuclear. Why? Because ICWA, Indian Foreign Service, ये सब चीजें हम लोगों को तो बहुत अच्छा लगता है. It's the panacea. I was at an event on climate change, and the very, very senior person from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, which is the Department of Atomic Energy financed institution, got up and said the panacea to India and sustainability is nuclear. यार जब हो जाएगा तो हो जाएगा, अभी तो नहीं मुझे लगता. So for all these talks, because it's ladies are here in the room, but there's a lovely 4-letter word which captures nuclear. And that's the nature of the game. But the fact of the matter is, large numbers are not doing that. Who today is dependent on nuclear power? There's one country, France. There's nobody else. And everybody has a degree of wariness. That people, for me, this Fukushima, what happened in Ukraine, what happened elsewhere, these, tainted a technology which has a great deal of potential. And they put us back by 20 years. Will we be able to come out of it? I hope so. I don't know about fusion. I don't know the answers to that. Similarly about green hydrogen. But I'm very convinced on one thing, that the answer is not in solar the way we do it today. It's not in wind the way we do it today. We have to find an alternate fuel, easy to use, like carbon. Whether it's going to be hydrogen or I don't know what, sodium, etc. I don't know the answers to that. But we'll have to find another fuel if we want to live life the way we are. And it's very unlikely in the next 20, 30 years that the way we live life is going to change drastically. It won't. Sir, you said, what was it that we would like? Frankly, on one side, on the C word, which is climate, what we would really like is, at least at the UNGA, which is actually not binding, but it brings a moral pressure on things, that people commit money, NCQG, they commit to do something in terms of emission reduction. When I say they, I don't mean India makes the commitment or even, let's say, China, but the developed world makes commitment. But can we make commitments on the immediate thing, which is the new quantified collective goal on finance? Can we say something in that side in the title? It'll help the negotiation. Remember, the G20, so first, let's talk. And what is it that we would like? We would like more than anything else that there is some explicit forward movements on the reform of global governance, more specifically and most specifically reform of the Security Council. That's what we would always like. Whether it'll happen or not, I don't know. The US has put forward a proposal, as somebody very high up out there said, लेकिन time bound negotiations के लिए नहीं तो नहीं ready. So we don't know the answer. If something like that happens, that should gladden our heart because it allows you to go up on the global high table. That's what Ambassador Mukherjee's session is going to focus on, and wish all power to ourselves. This is really global power play kind of a thing. But let me, before stopping, we would have said September 22, major milestone in the world. पता नहीं. Many of us who come from this world would say the G20 summit in Brazil, 18-19 November. Wow. The third time that a country from the global south would be hosting the G20. We can take our agendas forward. Yes, certainly. The Brazilians are actually the past masters of it. All these ideas that we have, we're newcomers to the game. It's the Latinos who started all this, your G77. It's all of them. The Brazilians are ace diplomats. I recognize where we come from. They are what they are because they have 3, 4, 5 generations of doing that. They're damn good. But look at what's happening in the world. The COP29 is taking place in Baku, 11th to 22nd of November. And we'd say, do we get money? Not enough money for a country like India, but do we get money on the table in serious amounts, not just 100 billion, wo bhi nahi kar paye. But guys, think about another date. And that date is the 4th of November. I don't know the answers to that. If any of you know the answers to that, you shouldn't be sitting here. You are way above all of us. I'm talking about the elections in the United States. That country matters, I'm afraid. That's the reality of things. Even though today they are 25% of global GDP and not 55% as things were, but they matter. 70% of global finance flows through New York. They set the trend. We can keep talking about de-dollarization, etc. None of us are anywhere near all that. Not in my life, in any case, in your lives. I wish you all the best. These are ground realities of things that we need to understand. So, stopping here, what would I say? Segue to the next session. Our great interest from the Summit of the Futures and its documentation. One, can we move on climate in the real sense of the term, which is in terms of doing something in terms of money? Can we reaffirm no poverty, no hunger, disease-free, and all the other technology-oriented things, water, space, etc.? Can we reaffirm? And most of all, can we do something in terms of a concrete step towards reform of global governance so that, and let's be very honest about it, that we have a good opportunity to be at a higher table of global governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I think we had an enlightened first session. I will request everyone to join us for tea, and we'll give it a 5-minute tea break now. So that, and please, if it gets delayed, please, you feel free to bring your tea inside the hall. And thank you.
The English word for tea in any case is tea or tea. By the way. Take care.
Hi, Shelly. Hello. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Come here more.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. I know, I hope you got the message. Yeah,
We only met on the online version.
online. Yeah.
So we'll start in like 5 minutes. We're just checking with the online speaker and we'll continue. Yes.
Can I just? Good morning, sir. Can you hear us? Sir, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. Sir, you can hear
Am
us?
I audible?
Yes, sir. Can you hear us also?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you, sir.
We've assembled again for session 2, Transforming Global Governance. And without further ado, I would request Ambassador Mukerjee to take the session forward. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Avni. And like Ambassador Manjeev Puri said in the previous session, I would really like to thank ICWA for bringing us into this activity. ICWA has, over these past years, really shown that it's on the ball, but more than that, that is able to also crystal gaze a little and see what lies ahead. And that makes these events very important. In this session, we are going to be touching again in the framework of the Summit of the Future, the topic of global governance and transforming global governance. As you heard in the previous session, it's one of the 5 parts of the Pact for the Future. It was an area which was widely expected to actually block progress on negotiating the documents for this summit. But surprisingly, it did not block. That was not the reason why the Pact for the Future has not been agreed to. It is probably related more to the other parts of the document where the Pact of the Future is still being negotiated as we speak, although Shelley showed us revision 4 of the document, which was issued on the 13th of September. So the topic for us here in India and in the ICWA is important because India is, to the best of my knowledge, one of the first founder members of the United Nations to call for reformed multilateralism. We did so in 2020 when the COVID pandemic was on, but the Prime Minister participated online. And if you saw his statements, he focused on the need for reform multilateralism, and he explained both the aspects of why reform multilateralism was necessary. First, to put a human-centric focus on global governance. I think that that is something that is a priority for India. It has been a priority since at least the 19th of September, 1947, when Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, leading the Indian delegation at the General Assembly of the United Nations a few weeks after our independence, said, and this is a famous quotation of hers, that food, clothing, shelter, this is what we need. We don't need armed to become part of an armed confrontation of the Cold War. So this was something that was stated by India in 1947, and this has provided a consistent framework for the human-centric focus of multilateralism and of global governance that India has stood for. It's nothing that is evolved suddenly out of the blue. It's a consistent policy. The other part of what the Prime Minister sort of has always referred to in calling for reform multilateralism is the need for an equal participation of India in decisions of global governance. Now, this is again linked with what happened in 1947 when we became democratic. And we became an independent country by 1950, adopted our constitution. And we have, in Article 51 of our constitution, actually emphasized that we will participate in global governance issues on the basis of treaties and agreements. That's Article 51 of the Indian Constitution. And I mention it because the second ambassador of India to the United Nations was one of the advisors of Dr. Ambedkar, Sir Benegal Rao. And he was active in the United Nations from 1948 on to 1952 when he was elected a judge in the International Court of Justice and unfortunately died in harness in The Hague. So this focus on equal participation and on an organization in which we are related to each other, we take part in decisions on the basis of treaties. See, today I think it's important, especially in here today in the ICWA, to emphasize that we are talking of a rules-based relationship on the basis of treaties and not on the basis of informal understandings that may come out from groupings, whether they be the G20 or they be the BRICS or they be the Quad. These are non-treaty groupings, and they have a different importance in terms of implementation, in terms of obligations, than the rights and obligations that we take on ourselves when we ratify the treaty. And India ratified the UN Charter. It's a treaty in October 1945. So we are a continuing state. We were a colony in 1945. We are a continuing state after 1945. And we are a member of the treaty. So these are the points that I think are important for me to flag before we get into the discussion. Today we have a very interesting panel. We have Professor Murthy, who is already, good morning, Professor Murthy. He's in Hyderabad.
Good morning. Good morning. Happy to be in the panel.
Yeah, I would
under
request.
chairmanship.
Yes, we have been on the panel before. I would request Professor Murthy to help us focus on the global governance as linked with the United Nations Security Council and prospects for reform of the Security Council as he sees it in terms of the summit of the future. We have Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University, but if I may say so, a friend of mine because we are from the same college. And we have Dr. Archana Negi, Associate Professor of the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament in JNU. I would request Dr. Kathuria to help us focus on global governance in terms of the international financial architecture, where the IMF, of course, is the most prominent organization. And I request Dr. Negi to help us focus on the international trade architecture in global governance, where the World Trade Organization plays a dominant role. So with these words, may I request to Professor Murthy. Sir, you have 10 minutes, is what I'm told each speaker has been allocated. So please, in the next 10 minutes, we look forward to hearing your views on Security Council reform in Summit of the Future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for this opportunity. Also, thanks to the Indian Council of World Affairs, which I used to visit as a research scholar in 1970s, almost regularly, including the weekends. So that's a kind of second home after JNU to me. I wish I had been physically present, but for some understandable reasons, I'm located in Hyderabad, presently teaching at NALSA as a visiting faculty. So please understand my inability to be physically with you. Let me start by saying that these summits are part of organizational culture. The United Nations has evolved and perfected in order to convert seemingly insurmountable challenges into opportunities, at least with a modest aim to build a momentum and create a conducive mood amongst various stakeholders, especially member governments, in order to lead to some concrete package of helpful actions in a wide arena of global concerns. So I welcome the series of summits happening in 2024, just as the summits are quite familiar terrain for those who are familiar with the UN work culture and those who are located in permanent missions in New York and elsewhere. For example, I don't see any substantive difference between the present series of summits on the one hand and the summits that began at least with the Millennium Summit in 2000 or 2005 World Summit and so on and so forth. So, so I would see a kind of continuity and making continuity a convenient vehicle for possible changes. The chair has mentioned transforming the global governance. That transforming is embedded with not only hype, but high hopes about the likelihood of breakthroughs. I would only like to prefer a word of cautious optimism when we look into the future, not only into the content of the pact for the future, but also the kind of questions that were posed in the concept note meant for the theme international peace and security. The three questions, let me forefront these questions. One, how member countries can enhance cooperation for international peace and security with various stakeholders, starting from United Nations system, regional organizations, civil society actors, business forces, and so on and so forth. In other words, widespread of stakeholders. It is a kind of recognition of the complex realities in the world today, but also it is pregnant with potential problems that could be felt by the existing sole stakeholders in the management of the system of international peace and security through the United Nations. I have in mind countries like India and third world countries who are a little cagey about enhancing the role of non-governmental actors, whether it is NGOs, etc. But this is a question posed for negotiation, intergovernmental dialogue on this. Second question is, how do member countries work for the root cause, not only at the surface level, but the root causes to address the complex tapestry of international conflicts. So in other words, widening, but this widening has been evolving progressively, somewhat noticeably too over the years. But acknowledgement that the negative piece is no longer a valid thesis, but the imperative of going deep into the grassroots causes of international conflict and security questions. That's again a restatement of what has been stated off and on, and a kind of needed reiteration in order to emphasize for concrete action on the part of the member countries and also through the United Nations system. The third question is do no harm principle, especially in terms of the development and use of dangerous new technologies in war strategies or even in non-military transactions, because the artificial intelligence and various other forms of latest communication technologies do pose dangers to the domains of privacy and so on and so forth. So all these questions do lie in the backdrop of the interactive dialogue. I would like to flag in the section on enhancing international peace and security through multilateralism about 4 or 5 issue areas. There are about 15, 16 action points that were listed in the latest revised version of the pact, which was distributed for government consideration on 13th September, if I remember correctly. One is the, as you rightly said, Mr. Chairperson, the human-centric action for sustenance of peace and protection of peace, which would touch upon not only protection of civilians, commitment to the safety and role of women and youth, and etc., etc. The major area dear to my heart is the peace of conduct and management of peace operations. And it has been before the Security Council, especially when open-ended debates have been happening under the initiative of non-permanent members like India, etc. The nature of the mandate, working towards clear, not ambiguous mandates, and also devising suitable practical political strategies along with the transition phases. So, in other words, relooking at the compass of peace operations. The third interesting area I would like to draw your attention to, this peace enforcement operations. Very, very interestingly, the pact in the present form, hopefully it will be cleared in the summit ultimately, is that peace enforcement operations should be accompanied by inclusive strategies. That means there should be no preferential kind of regime change, as it happened in Libya, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Inclusive strategies and other non-military approaches to address root causes of the conflict. In other words, this debate about the use of force for wrong ends with excessive means of disproportionate nature, these have become concerns apart from the subjects like terrorism, transnational organized crime, and protection of peace soldiers, peacekeepers, safety and protection of, and of course, nuclear disarmament. The prioritization, I think this is a sentiment widely prevalent in General Assembly debates. That of all the subjects in the general and complete disarmament, nuclear disarmament is of foremost importance and priority. Incidentally, this was precisely what was emphasized in the first disarmament summit in 1978 of the General Assembly. Nuclear disarmament first, other things next. And of course, the caveat here is the security guarantees existing in the nuclear regime will have to be respected and upheld. So there is a catch here, and I don't know the call for implementation or adherence to the nuclear weapons ban treaty, which was one of the latest initiatives. So there is going to be, in many of these areas, there is going to be tension between the two main principal organs of the United Nations. The latest story in the, I would say, proxy war between the two principal organs, General Assembly and Security Council. The latest story is what had happened yesterday when General Assembly, not the Security Council, General Assembly had taken a follow-up action in the form of adoption of resolution by a respectable majority. I don't say overwhelming majority, by a respectable majority, that Israel should be made to vacate from the occupied territories as a follow-up to the advisory opinion of the World Court. In other words, when we talk about transforming the global governance, not only the question of Security Council composition, working methods, decision-making procedures, but also the interrelationship, the intra-organizational dynamics that are going to be very, very important. I think those who are interested in the Security Council restructuring must address alongside the questions of how to uphold the upward tendency in the General Assembly's assertive role, at least in the last about 10 years, especially since 2005, 2006. Let me turn now to the reform question. Let me briefly refer to what Secretary General had said in the General Assembly yesterday. He said, which is quite unexceptionable, he said the international organizations, the cluster of organizations were created by past generations for future generations, which have become quite irrelevant. So the bygone generation had created bygone set of international organizations, which need to be, this is unexceptionable. But what he had said in a very interesting mix of high hopes and also calibrated caution in this for pragmatism in the, he said this is a once in a generation summit. I think I would take this as a with a pinch of salt, because these things are a common feature in all high-level summit meetings. It's not once in a generation, but I believe in 2 years or 3 years, there will be one more high-level summit in order to consider the follow-up to this present summit. So there is a hype in this, in what Secretary General had said, but it is also very notably, intriguingly, he had said that there is important work so far done in the deliberations. I'm not privy to in concrete terms what has been agreed upon. He has said work so far for, that leads to potential breakthrough on important points of restructuring the Security Council. The most important such breakthrough ever since the 1963 enlargement of non-permanent members. I believe there is a high-level advisory group that was constituted with people like, Anne Slaughter and others. And what I gather from the inside deliberations is that the document, ultimately, the Secretary General will has constituted a group, maybe chairs, co-chairs of that intergovernmental to compile the existing models. The existing models, whether it is A, Model B, rather than arriving or working for consensus, through consensus for a most likely model, whether it is a set of additional permanent members. So this cannot be, please permit me to say that this cannot be the most important breakthrough since 1963. I would, but he is right in saying, and this is what I would like to underline, he is right in saying that member states should adopt a spirit of compromise. I think this is an advice given to people, to countries, to our esteemed statespersons, spirit of compromise, whether it is uniting for consensus club or G4 plus 2 African countries, and some permanent members, some S5, etc. Some compromise. I would like to I will take a minute to come back to
Professor,
what can be the compromise.
Just 1 minute more. 1 minute more, please.
Oh, okay.
We have 3 other speakers. Yes, please.
Okay. Now I would like this, if India has to think afresh about what can be compromised, in order to make UFC people also a little less unhappy, I would say the intermediate solution of different permutations and combinations, dependent, of course, no veto is possible. And I would also say that whatever changes that have happened have avoided charter amendments so far and have made, whether it's Human Rights Council establishment, etc. And I think there can be a formula where we can agree that there can be elected continuing members instead of permanent members. It's not for me to propose a compromise formula for the stakeholders, but what I'm stressing is compromise solutions surrounding, revolving around intermediate solution, neither interminable membership, permanent membership, or a 2-year term, somewhere in between. I'm sure it is possible. Secondly, I would say I'm a little uncomfortable with this formulation, though politically very convenient. Charter is sacrosanct. We should not disturb this. I understand at one level. If charter is sacrosanct, countries like India who are thought to be thought leaders, they can think of using as an initiative Article 109, which talks about at least convene a conference which requires 2/3 majority, which you have, and any 9 Security Council, at least throw open to the generality of membership to discuss a wide range of reform issues which can be a compromise to some concessions to loss of some advantages elsewhere. So in other words, comprehensive approach rather than secluded, isolated approach to security. And if charter is going to be indispensable, inevitable, inescapable framework in this. So my suggestion is India should consider 109 approach in order to put pressure on those countries which don't want any kind of. So in other words, the key is with Global South, and Global South requires leadership, and it is for India to decide whether it should play a leadership role for ideas, and with the support of experienced and insightful policymakers and think tanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time to give us both the points on the agenda for transforming global governance, as well as specifically on Security Council reform. And I would like to share with you, Professor, that I entirely endorse your proposal for Article 109 of the Charter. It has been overlooked for too long. It was a commitment given to Ramaswamy Mudaliar in 1945. I think we need to pursue it. Thank you. May I request Dr. Kathuria to, you have 10 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. Thank you, Ambassador Mukerjee, for that really warm introduction. And thank you, ICWA, for having me here. It's good to be back in the environs of Lutyens, Delhi. I'm now in Dadri at Shiv Nadar University, so it's really good to be back here. So I'll talk about the international financial system and the sort of need for reform, and G20 has been sort of completely seized of that matter. But I also want to preface my comments here by talking about some of my own experience, both as an academic and as a sort of representing an institution that was deeply engaged in G20. And what I saw as the evolution of this international financial restructuring or reform that you requested me to speak about. So my experience, so foregrounding this or backgrounding this with some amount of sort of economics and liberalism, which is, I think, based, which is exactly what all these multilateral institutions were based on. We were sold, if I'm being critical, it's, as I said, based of my experience. We were sold this idea of liberal economics for a long time. And I'm not a red shirt, so let me please discount that aspect. So I'm not speaking from ideology. I'm speaking, as I said, from experience. So we were sold this idea of neoliberalism, and many, economists of all ilks were sold this idea of neoliberalism. What was new was that it was post-World War. And what was liberal was that we were told that liberal markets, unfettered markets, would lead to efficiencies in the society, efficiencies increase welfare. And obviously, if you look at the history of markets and if you look at the history of economics, that hasn't happened. And therefore, I'm using the term that we were sold this dream of trickle-down economics. And none of that has happened, neither in developing economies, which have got the short end of the stick, nor in developed economies, because we see problems of inequality, we see problems of climate change affecting most economies in the world. And of course, now aging is another problem. I was just in Germany last week in a delegation that met all government officials, including their foreign office. And Germany is, of course, thinking about a rule-based system, thinking afresh about a rules-based system, and they want us to sort of help them reconstruct that rules-based system because they are in a problem. And as Mr. Jaishankar once said, if the rest of the world has a problem, it's their problem. If Europe has a problem, it's the world's problem, right? I mean, and a lot of what I'm going to say, is around that sort of sentiment that developing economies need to assert themselves, and India has arrived at the stage where it's going to assert itself. And financial system is probably one architecture where it can, but there are others as well. So this dream of sovereignty and efficiency didn't happen. And this sort of was both in the context of individuals, because, liberal economics, the Hayek, the Friedmans of this world, this was much more in terms of individuals, but it also applies to countries. But there is a difference between individuals and countries. And the difference is that individuals in a country, there is a well-oiled machinery of the judicial system that does enforcement. And so you have rules, you have traffic lights, you can't just do what you want, unless you're, of course, in Delhi, but you can't just do what you want. You have a sort of system that will enforce those rules. The rules-based system will work when you have proper enforcement. Now, post-World War, when the IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions and the World Bank was created, at that time, all these rules were made by whom? Who set the agenda? Who set the rules? Who set the enforcement? Of course, GATT didn't have enforcement. IMF, hardly has enforcement except when you give loans. So there was no enforcement in the global rules-based system that sort of evolved, except when the WTO came in, we began sort of dispute settlement and appellate body. But when it became inconvenient for the West has been giving industrial subsidies. You think Airbus would have existed today? Airbus wouldn't have existed today. All the rules were flouted when it didn't sort of serve their convenience. I'm not saying India is an angel here, but I'm saying the West, when it became inconvenient for them, flouted the rules. And that is precisely what Trump has done. When it became sort of inconvenient for them to agree with the dispensation or with the decisions of the appellate body and the also before that, the dispute settlement and the appellate body, they withdrew and they basically defenestrated the WTO. It's dysfunctional. And therefore, all this talk about reforming the multilateral system. And I think India has always been a votary of the international, both financial system and the trade order. So I guess Archana will speak on the trade. So let me sort of spend a little bit of time talking about, so in this background, let me talk a little bit about the financial system. We know that sort of in 1999, when you had the East Asian financial crisis, there was a very famous sort of quote which is attributed to Paul Krugman. At that time, the international financial system, the IMF, when it went into a country, it advised countries to do three things. And sort of when they came to India also to do consultations, they still come to India to do Article 4 consultations. They're not so sort of deterministic nowadays because countries are now in a sense, they've become much more bottom up than they were during the East Asian financial crisis. there were three things that the International Financial or International Monetary Fund used to advise countries: fiscal deficit, fiscal deficit, fiscal deficit. You can see, I'm not saying this. This is said by various experts. Control your fiscal deficit. And Paul Krugman is reputed to have responded saying that you're going into a country which is suffering from a crisis and you want to impose austerity and increase taxes and impose austerity on a country, that a sort of prescription would be the Keynesian prescription of more sort of spending, and it would be more sort of provision of public goods and less taxation so people could spend. So this was a cure that was worse than the disease, and the IMF actually, he said, would have killed the patient. It's the famous quote of Krugman during the financial crisis. And the reason I say this is that, you know, the imposition of conditionalities and the entry of Greece into the European Union, when they conveniently looked the other way, when they didn't meet the standards, etc., these double standards which Mr. Jaishankar was referring to in his comment have applied pretty much to the international financial system. Ben Bernanke was told by Raghuram Rajan that you have this exorbitant privilege, when he was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, you have this exorbitant privilege of printing a currency and getting away with it because the rest of the world is willing to hold it, and you're following this practice of quantitative easing or fiscal stimulus to sort of stimulate your way out of the global financial crisis, which of course was caused by the financial excesses of the system in the West, pretty much. And when Raghu told Ben Bernanke that you are being irresponsible in your monetary policy because you don't consider the spillover benefits of your policies on other countries, and you must do that. Other countries need not do that, but you must do that because you have spillover effects. Now, it was only somebody like Raghuram Rajan who could actually say that, and Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve Board and the governor of the Federal Reserve then sort of, if not sort of do it, at least paid lip service to the fact that there were these monetary spillovers to other countries, which had, you know, bubble effects. Remember the Tater tantrum in 2013 in India when money sort of left and there was a currency crisis and the rupee depreciated, and it didn't appreciate that much, but, you know, Philippines, Turkey, they had a huge problem because money just retreated. It's hot money, so it went. So what's the point of what I'm saying? You know, what are the recommendations here? As I said, the G20 has been working on this since the beginning. I mean, the G20 started in 1999, but it actually expanded and brought in and became more inclusive, as the ambassador was saying in his opening remarks, with the human sort of dimension. Of course, Bangladesh says that if you're not on the table, you're on the plate. If you're not on the menu, if you're not on the table, then you're on the menu, right? Or you're on the plate. So it's still not inclusive, but G20 is, of course, bigger than the G4 or the G7. And therefore, there is some representation. And G20 has been working on this for a long time. And a couple of things I would say before I conclude. One is, there is a rules-based order, which, as I said, when it became inconvenient, and we do the same thing in our country. So, as I said, don't feel that we don't practice the same thing within our country. We do. But since we're talking about global systems, so I'm referring only to the global systems. There's one is a rules-based system, and the other is the culture of enforcement and the culture of the sort of, I'll give you examples on both and before I conclude. So rules are nice to have because then it gives, as in the WTO, it gives the weaker countries as much of a right, as much of a vote as it gives to the bigger countries. And then smaller countries had one vote and they could block any reform in the WTO. And therefore, the single undertaking that happens, you know, developed countries are saying now plurilateral systems or of course, free trade areas have always been there. But plurilateral engagement, whoever, a coalition of the willing sort of things to try and get away from the dysfunctionality of the multilateral system. So you have a rules-based organization. And in IMF, the rules are that you will have conditionalities. And that's where I'm saying that it's the culture of how are those conditions? If I'm given a loan when I have a balance of payments crisis, when the IMF comes in, of course, IMF will say it's my money. And therefore, I'm imposing these conditionalities on you. So you have to abide by the conditionalities. So there are rules, but I'm also saying there is a culture of the organization, and remarks like Raghu's, remarks like Paul Krugman's sort of certainly affect the application of those rules. But are there rules that are to be amended? Of course, there are rules that need to be amended. And the sort of Article 15 increase of the quota has been on the table for such a long time. Belgium has more of a representation. And we keep saying that we are going to become the third largest economy in the world. We will, of course, become the third largest economy in the world. With 1.4 billion people, with any level of per capita income, we will become the third largest economy in the world. And Germany was telling us, we were there in the meetings, and they were saying, you're going to become the third largest country in the world. Of course we are. We'll even become the second largest country. In PPP terms, we are already the third largest country in the world. So we don't have that commensurate representation because, as I said, these rules were framed by the West. They were framed by a multilateral order that was created by the West for the West, really. And there was a lot of unequal sort of sharing of the benefits that happened, which is why I was saying that we were sold a dream that unfettered markets would lead to increase in welfare. Yes, they will, provided there are rules and they are implemented. And but those sharing of those benefits have been, Emmanuel talked about unequal trade in the 60s, and lots of people talked about. So the sharing of the benefits is unequal. So how do you combat if they're not going to give us an increase in quota? I mean, it's going to be a glacial process. I mean, changing institutions takes enormous amount of time. But there's so many examples of China say, okay, if you don't reform the system, of course, China has lots of problems on its own, but it says we will create, and the rest of the world will come together. We'll create a BRICS. We'll create the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is now in operation, and is it providing loans as well. So if you can't get the international system to work for emerging markets, you have to create alternatives, which is what has happened. But we still need to reform the international financial system. One, as I said, the culture of the organization needs to be reformed. And I'll give you one more example where the culture could be reformed, but also much more quota. And India is willing to pay more for its quota. China is willing to pay more, but they are not. I remember discussions when I was in ICWA, Mr. Shuma Chakravarti, who was the head of the European Development Bank, he came to ICWA and he said, why doesn't India become a member of the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development? So we said, will you give us a seat at the table? Or will you give us a seat at, behind the table? He said, you'll get a seat behind the table because we're not going to accept too much money from you. We'll take some money, but we won't take. But China said, you tell us how much you want. We want a seat on the table in the middle, right here, where we are sitting, not at the back. EBR Shuma said that'll be difficult to do because there's a whole system which is and excuse me for using this term. There are white men sitting there, right, in the middle, and so I hope this is just for sort of illustration. I don't want to make a racist comment, just for illustration. So the culture of the organization, again, of the International Fund Monetary System is such that the president of the World Bank will be from the United States, and the president of the IMF will be from Europe. And, 1 year from the United States, 1 year from Europe. And so this sort of plays on, the seesaw plays on. Of course, it could be changed 1 year. You could have 2 people from Europe, as you have now, in succession. But largely, IMF would have a president from the US, and then 1 year from the European Union. And that's sort of agreed. It's not written in law. It's not a rule, but it's what happens. So both the rules need to be changed, as well as the culture of the organization needs to be changed. Otherwise, developing countries will continue to resist. Now that we have much more voice, India has much more voice. China, of course, has begun to have much more voice in the system, and they are exerting pressure Of course, I'm talking about the other pressures, of course, China is exerting because it's become much more powerful economically and militarily. But even in the financial system, China has begun to exert its influence. And therefore, I think the West, the old system, when the US was the hegemon, things worked really well, 60s, 70s, 80s, things worked really well. But when there is a challenge to, post-Cold War, when there is now the emergence of India, the emergence of China, that system, that rule-based system is not working well, precisely because, as Mr. Murthy was saying, as Ambassador was saying, there will have to be a compromise. And that compromise, I think, can only be one way, which is the West has to give up much more because it has gained much more in the past, and the West will have to give us much more, which means to accommodate in India and China into the international financial system. They should have much more of a say in the international financial system, etc. The quota should be increased immediately and not take this whole process of approval in Congress. It'll never happen. If it goes to Congress in the US, it'll never happen. Why will it happen? So either you create an alternative system, which China has already done. And I'll give you one last example where the West is facing the heat. And this happened, I think, only 2 days ago. When Australia was the presidency of the G20 in 2014, there was a huge issue relating to multinational corporations and base erosion and profit shifting. I don't know, many of you might be aware of BEPS. Who was working on BEPS? It was the OECD that was working on BEPS. Who are the people who were sort of researching on profit sharing, these agreements with the multinational or drafting rules for the multinational corporation? It was the OECD. Unfortunately, the OECD is European, and it was it wasn't antagonistic to the big corporations of the United States, but it was at least sort of doing things which would have been much more in favor of developing economies, not completely. Now they said, why should BEPS be in OECD? Why don't you move BEPS to the United Nations? And finally, the BEPS now is placed in the United Nations, where it gets much more of a representation, rather than just being a club in OECD or club in the West, and sort of all the people who are working on it are from the West. So, I mean, you're also, when you set the agenda, when you set the rules, of course, you're driven by what you see and what you've been experienced to, which is why I said, let me sort of speak from the benefit of my experience in this area. So, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll open for questions after Dr. Negi has her 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Chairperson, and very distinguished co-panelists. Happy to be here and to get a chance to speak in this very, very August gathering where I see so many familiar faces from different phases of my life. So very happy to be here, and a very special greeting to Professor Murthy, who's joined online, and he knows why I'm extending that greeting. So very good to see you and hear you, sir, here. I have a PowerPoint, but that's only a backdrop sort of graphic to keep people awake. It is to build a narrative. It doesn't really have information on it, but if you can play it, then well and good. But I will start speaking anyway, because the 10-minute Damocles sword is hanging. Summit of the Futures is, the title I've gone with, because that's the title that came to us. But really, when I was preparing to speak here, the title of what I wanted to speak, which I didn't put, I wasn't brave enough to put it there, but I would like to share it here, was really why I'm skeptical about the Summit of the Future. And the reason why I'm skeptical is because today I'm speaking from the trade lens, and I'm sorry to say there isn't very good news at all coming, at least from that lens. There is very little to report in terms of progress, if at all. So let me very quickly go through this and first of all, locate the trade lens or trade negotiations from the structures of the Summit of the Future. So if you could very quickly go through, I will keep saying next because I'm not in control of the PowerPoint slides, but if you could just, next, please. Next. So the UNGA session opened on 10th of September this year, which you see in the previous slide. Why this is interesting is because I come back to this, the previous one, please, the one before. Yes, so the gentleman here, apart from the UN Secretary General, is the president of the 79th session of the UNGA. And I wanted to, flag this photograph because I come back to this point a little bit later on. Next, please. Now, at this particular session, we all know that this event, very high level event is happening, the Summit of the Future. There are certain expected outcomes which are listed here. I'm sure they were discussed quite extensively in the previous session, in the morning session as well. The three big documents, the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations. Various revised versions of all three of these drafts are available. Now there is some new language that that diplomacy is using. Earlier, we used to speak, I'm sure in your time as well, sir, it was square brackets, right? When a text was not agreed upon. And now there is this new language of the silence is broken. So the silence is broken on these drafts basically means that there is no agreement on this draft. And unfortunately, that's what has happened with all of these drafts, which means there is no consensus on these drafts as yet. And we don't really know what's going to happen in the next few hours, etc. But that's the new language. The silence is broken, no agreement. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the Pact for the Future is essentially built around these 5 thematics, and I'm sure you're familiar with them already, but we are going to be focusing on the transforming global governance part. The next slide, please, is about the Global Digital Compact. I'm not going to discuss too much of this here, but this is again built around 5 objectives, and all 3 documents speak to each other, of course, but there is a lot of vagueness in the language. Everything is as if you've heard it before. There isn't something, anything new that you can really find in terms of what is being proposed. The third document that you will find is the next one, please. The Declaration on Future Generations, which is organized as such, so what you see on the slide, but not so important. The next one, please. So basically, I'm coming directly to the 5th point of the Pact for the Future, which is about transforming global governance. And here I want to pull out the parts of the Summit for the Future where trade basically appears. If you look at the 5th section, which is on transforming global governance, they don't really talk about the WTO at all within that. The only reference is a very extensive reference to UN reform. So they're talking about Security Council, they're talking about UNGA, peace building mission, human rights, etc., the entire architecture. They're also talking about the international financial institutions, but limiting it to the World Bank and the IMF. The WTO, however, doesn't go away. And where you really find it, interestingly, is in the SDG part, right, which is probably what you discussed. So if you go back to Action 5, it talks about ensuring the multilateral trading system and projects it as an engine for sustainable development. Now, this placing itself, I find very interesting because now it's as if, the UN is basically making a claim that the WTO is an engine for sustainable development because, well, it appears in the SDG section to begin with and not really in the transforming global governance part. So it talks about the usual language you will find here. I'm reading out bits of it. We are committed to a rules-based, non-discriminatory, open, fair, inclusive, equitable, transparent, multilateral trading system. You also have references to the Future Generations document, which you have, where clause 11 talks about a commitment to a stronger, more effective, resilient multilateral system based on international law, and clause 21, which talks of an inclusive, transparent, and effective multilateral system yet again. So this is where I am drawing my space from to speak on trade negotiations. So what is happening in the WTO? Next slide, please. The WTO is in crisis and has been in crisis for quite some time, right? And I'm sure most of you who follow what's happening at the WTO are aware of these crises, but I'm going to very, very quickly rush through the breakup of what this crisis looks like. So the next slide, please. First and foremost, of course, and these are, of course, just I think cartoons which have appeared, but they have been collected into particular types of crisis that the WTO faces. So I start with the crisis of credibility and legitimacy, which the WTO faces in terms of its internal structures, in terms of who it's servicing, etc. And in terms of the larger sort of theoretical, the fact that it is based in this whole neoliberal framework of free trade, and is free trade really good for everyone? It was said before, the trickle down never happened, etc. So that crisis of legitimacy, of credibility continues. A second crisis, which is really severe, the next slide, please, is that two tracks, in fact, all three tracks of the WTO's work are in crisis, which is what the WTO essentially does is it makes trade rules, it has a dispute resolution system, and then it has a trade policy review mechanism. And all three of these are in jeopardy, but especially so the rules. That's an older story because the Doha round has basically been going round and round. So it hasn't really got anywhere. There have been zero fruitful negotiations, except for some very minor, exceptions. The bigger and more recent crisis has been that of the dispute resolution body. And this is really, really severe. Because let me locate the WTO in terms of what it means in international law. The WTO's dispute resolution system was in its heyday the most effective dispute resolution system there was in the international system, because you had a way to implement what came out of it, right? Unlike the ICJs and the other tribunals, etc. That's one way to look at it. The second way to look at it was that the WTO's dispute resolution system was the heartbeat of the organization. It was the crown jewels, as they called it, right, of the organization, because making rules makes no sense if you do not have a dispute resolution system. This system is in jeopardy because, and this was the only international tribunal or dispute resolution body that offered you an appeal system. This was very, very interesting. The appellate body was very important in terms of its contribution also to rule interpretation. 2019, December, the appellate body basically slowed down and came to a halt because new members were not being, there was a sort of WTO version of a veto and new members were not being elected, and therefore you didn't have an appellate body in place. So today you have a system of what is called appealing into the void, which means that countries who are in dispute over trade can go to the panel, but if they are not happy with what the panel says, they have nowhere to appeal. They can appeal, but that appeal goes into outer space because there's nobody to deal with that appeal, right? So appealing into the void. Anyway, we can come back to this. A third element or component of this crisis, the next slide, please, is the member states themselves. Professor Murthy mentioned compromise. This is a very endangered species or a rare metal in the WTO because the power game, especially of the bigger powers, and in the recent years, US and China in particular, because today when people speak of WTO reform, they often say, why don't we discuss this way of reforming the WTO while keeping US and China out of it? Because they are never going to be part anyway of any of these reforms, right? The next slide, please. The other part is also that the newer players now have a voice and now want to be on board. So countries like India and China, which up till the Uruguay round had very little say, now in this new organization have much to say. And the agricultural trade negotiations, for example, tell us that these new players do have a point and sometimes can slow down the negotiations because of that, etc. The next point, please, and very quickly. Alternatives, the fact that the WTO is unable to deal with external shocks, be it the impact of COVID on international trade, pandemic, environmental crisis, or even the turning to alternatives such as regional trade agreements and the impact that has had on the WTO. Now I'm going to just mention next one, please. So this is basically where the future of the WTO is as far as the overall. Next slide, please. So what has happened in recent? Why did I start on the skeptical note is because earlier this year in February, the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO took place in Abu Dhabi. And certain homework was given to this ministerial conference. You're going to fix the dispute resolution system by the end of 2024. We must have a working dispute resolution system back. Didn't happen. very, very little dismal outcome of this ministerial conference. When you ask the WTO, they do have answers. They say, no, we are still relevant. But, the examples of relevance that they give is, well, 2 new countries have joined the WTO, right? So Comoros and Timor-Leste are the 2 newest members of the WTO. Because countries are joining us, we couldn't be irrelevant totally, right? That's one way to look at it. Another interesting argument which comes from the WTO is that, well, even though the WTO is in shambles, member states usually want to be WTO rule compliant, right? So that's a good sign, etc. So some sectoral outcomes came out of this, but the main sort of issue which was to be discussed, which was coming to a resolution on dispute resolution in particular, did not happen in the WTO ministerial conference. Now, of course, there is very little hope because there is no other ministerial in this year, right? And you have the US presidential election standing in between, which means before the end of the year, this is certainly not happening. So the next slide, please. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that if you break down global governance structures and talk about transformations, the trade governance structures certainly show that there is stagnation, if not a regression as far as, where they were. Now, looking forward always means looking back. This is my favorite part, but I'm going to skip it because I'm just harking back to the earlier days of the charter. You talked about that Smudaliar there in the black and white picture signing the charter. Next, please, if you can just. And the fact that the charter has always been, right, even when it was signed, I mean, it said right then the charter can be expanded and improved. No one claims that it is new or final or a perfect instrument. This is an often cited part of Harry Truman's speech in 1945. The next slide shows you the 61 JFK. I can skip this. Next slide, please. So this is an example from history which shows you that global transformation is possible. 2005, it did happen when the UN 60 summit took place, and there were 2 concrete outcomes which didn't happen at the summit, but happened subsequently within that year of the UNGA's functioning. One was the upgradation of the UN Human Rights Commission to the Human Rights Council, and the other was the setting up of the brand new UN peace-building architecture in 2005. So this is to basically put in a positive note to the narrative. And the next, please. So this is what is leading up finally. And let me not, my time is really going haywire. So let me just conclude by making a few concluding points. And the next slide, please, I think is about just, looking ahead. So what we are keeping in mind, and so just the last 1 minute, we have to remember that there are intersecting timelines ahead. The current UN Secretary General's term will end. Remember also that the UN SDGs are drawing to a close. So very soon, countries are going to start talking about that. What comes after the SDGs? Because before the SDGs, there were the MDGs. Before that was Agenda 21. So a whole lot of new semantics will need to be thought up, what replaces the SDGs after that. So I'm not sure how much of these documents in terms of real terms are going to fructify. The other missing part is, of course, the spirit of compromise. And one little exercise which I think would be very useful is to do a content analysis of the UN General Assembly, the general debates when countries speak there, and see how distant they are from what is written in the summit documents, the 3 documents we began with. That basically shows you that countries are not willing to come up with that compromise and make those sort of offers. Right? And this is one thing which the WTO persistently complains about. They say there is a distance between the discussions that take place in Geneva and the national capitals. So the countries are speaking another language, singing another song, whereas the WTO is completely distant from, and that is why the ministerial conferences don't end up coming up with outcomes. The Article 109 of the UN Charter, I know this is also your favored. You speak about this a lot. There is potential to reopen and review the Charter. But I think some very basic things need to be first identified. When we talk about the future generations, for example, in this first fancy document, please remember that the first mention of future generations was way back in 1987 when Brundtland Commission said intergenerational equity. So many of the younger people in this room were the future generation at that time, 1980s. And now that whole idea of the future generation is just being pushed further and further away as convenient. So are we really serious about this whole concept of a future generation? I'm not very sure, because this is already more than 50 years away from the original conception of the idea of the future generation. So can we put a time frame on this if we have a document called? So with some of these there was some other examples which I'll skip, but with these very skeptical remarks, I will basically stop speaking here. And thank you so much for.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Negi. It's really wonderful to listen to people who have spoken both from their deep knowledge and their experience. And before I open the floor for discussions, we have, I think, 10 minutes. Avni's promised us lunch late. So yeah, so we have 10 minutes for you all to raise any questions. Please identify who you want to answer your question. And I will throw the floor open. But I'd like to make two or three just concluding points from my understanding of what we have listened to in this session. The point which I think is important, and I repeat it again, is that the United Nations system is a treaty system. And I think a lot of people need to keep reminding themselves that we are able to talk, we can throw a lot of ideas, we can become thought leaders, but eventually all that has to be reduced and brought down into the treaty. And I think that it's important for us, this Article 109, I know, Archana, you're talking, I have been trying to speak about Article 109 for the last 6-7 years now, including to the American Foreign Service, because every good treaty has a review provision in it. And Article 9 is a review provision. Unfortunately, for almost 50 years or 40 years, Article 109 has been sold in the UN system as something linked with Security Council reform. It is not true. Security Council reform is only one of the provisions. Like when we say, follow the UN Charter, Ukraine, etc., etc. Now, why doesn't anyone stand up and say that, yes, the UN Charter also has Article 25. And on Ukraine, you have a unanimous resolution of the Security Council 2202, adopted on 17 February 2015, which requires a certain series of actions to have been taken. Why were they not taken? So it's just that we have a stand on Ukraine about this is not an era of war, and then people tell us about non-interference and territorial integrity and so on. That's Article 2. But there's Article 25, which is perhaps the only legally binding article in the whole treaty. And we all agree to abide by the decisions of the Security Council. So the UN Charter is more than just the preamble and Article 2 of the UN Charter. And I'm glad, therefore, that at least somewhere we are looking at Article 109. And Professor Murthy, thank you for pointing that out in your remarks. The other thing which I'd like to say, and I'll just conclude on that and open the floor for questions, is that when we conceptualized global governance after the Second World War, and I know Rajat also spoke of it, these institutions were dominated by the colonial powers. I mean, to use a different word from the color that you're using, the colonial powers. Today, I mean, there was an article by Kishore Mahbub Ali, which was very good, because he said the United Kingdom should give up its permanent membership and give it to India. But basically that is the point. That in my time, I used to joke with the United Kingdom ambassador in New York, saying that you have 53 members of the Commonwealth, give one of us 1 week at a time, and we'll have one permanent member at any one point of time from the Commonwealth. But those are jocular, light-hearted. You have to amend the charter, and to amend the charter, you need a spirit of compromise, as Professor Murthy has said. That and the charter itself is very nice, because Article 18 gives you a very clear way forward. If you don't have consensus, you have a vote. And if it's an important issue like Security Council reform, it's a 2/3 majority vote. So, that is always there, that elephant in the room. So with that, I would like to request you to raise your questions. And if I see any hands, I'll recognize them. Yeah, please.
regarding the recommission of the, as you explained how the review is paralyzed and how this not multilateral. Yeah. So in order to reform the review, is it possible to bring in the framework of the matter by taking the principles of fair trade, not free trade, fair trade and equity, and also bringing in and another principle make it inclusive and transparent. Is it possible and to have highlighted that the
My question is to actually anyone on the panel. I was just, if we step back a little bit, in preparation for the Summit of the Future, the UN Secretary General had prepared some, briefs, monographs. One of it was the new agenda for peace. And when we look at that new agenda for peace, there was nothing substantial in it, despite the fact that it was a completely consultative process that had been gone through. 33 countries contributing, many regional organizations contributing. And I'm sure on many of the other issues that he put out those policy briefs, similar things have happened. Despite all of that, why is it that there is so much pessimism when we are coming to the summit? And what is lacking in that process? And I think all of you here are experts, with experience and knowledge. So I'd like to know that. Thank you.
Thank you. One more. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Myself, Pooja Sehbag. I am Research Associate at TERI. And firstly, greetings to Professor Murthy. And my question is to Professor Negi. So basically, this is in context of future of green technology cooperation. In the existing geopolitical dynamics, especially between US and China, US being one of, with the potential to invest money, and China has an edge on green technology. So there is possibility of trade barriers. There are instances such as China restricting trade of graphite to Sweden and also restricting trade of rare earth metals to Japan. So how do you see the prospect in future, for ambitious initiatives like green trade rules? Thank you.
Thank you. So I would suggest that the second question, which Arpita asked, Professor Murthy, perhaps you would be in the best position to give a response to why there's so much pessimism regarding the outcome of this summit. That is the question she has asked, given the preparations that were made by extensive consultation process and getting inputs from various people. Why is there pessimism regarding the outcome? So, Professor, if you could answer that, and then I'll ask Dr. Negi to answer the other two.
Yeah, pessimism is not something to be worried about, I would say, but because experience gives us the privilege of familiarity with pessimism rooted in the underperformance of various ideas, initiatives. So the history of high-level summits, documents with hyped and hyper words, they have always invariably been followed by inaction and lack of interest. Therefore, I would say the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, he is after all a politically savvy person, given his long experience. So he did not want to stick his neck out by putting in some controversial proposals and ideas. That is how the chief executives of UN in the past and presently also in the future, unless the nature of the United Nations system is fundamentally, radically altered, going beyond the intergovernmental nature of the organization. I would like to add a note to my answer. I would like to add a note to the answer when I said 109. What I would like to, this is unsolicited advice to the South Bloc, Ministry of Excellence. This, our dialogue about the global governance structures transforming, I would say only incrementally adjusting is a more pragmatic pattern of action rather than using high-sounding words. I would strongly urge the government and policymakers not to convene dialogues on the eve of these high-level summits, but on a continuing basis. Establish working groups involving academia, bureaucrats, and even journalists, etc. In all party, there should be it should be inclusive on a continuing basis, just as United States did before Dumbarton Oaks, after or before San Francisco. I think we have much to learn from the processes involved in the making of the United Nations. Let's not expect the West, we Indians try to react. We are happy to react rather than proactive. I would say be proactive now. The time for proactivity is now, not in the distant future generations. No, let us not leave the task to future generation. And to add, I'm very happy Dr. Archana Negi had uttered a word of caution about future generations. Not only Brundtland Commission, but even 1945 Charter talks about successor generations. There's nothing new about it. Let us not add meanings, non-existing meanings into this kind of commonplace expressions in order to create unnatural, artificial, perhaps unproductive terminologies. So my vote is for pragmatism, caution, conservatism, incrementalism. Last sentence, sir, with your permission.
Yes.
Major international organizational architectures have been attempted in the 20th century after catastrophic wars. Under the pressure of wars, major revamping had taken place, rather imperfect revamping had taken place.
Yeah.
Now, let us not expect too much. In the absence of that, I don't know what will be the consequences of another major generic war, but in the absence of that war, trying to recast, revamp, restructure the existing global governance architecture, I think we should not be over optimistic about this.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. And I'll take whatever you have said. I have requested Nutan to take note and maybe take advantage of the gap in all these documents that we have been talking about today. Nowhere in any of these documents is there any reference to the 80th anniversary of the United Nations next year. So perhaps ICWA can generate a series of workshops or dialogues that you have suggested.
Sir,
of the 80th anniversary of the United Nations.
Indian Council of World Affairs in 1950s organized working groups in 1950s. There must be a bound volume, red bound volume in the library, Sapro Library. Please look up there. It's a useful kind of preface for kind of thinking process ahead.
Thank you. So, Dr. Negi, the last word is yours, the answers to those two questions.
Will certainly not fit in a word because they're such big questions. But on a lighter note, Arpita, it's a good strategy to be a pessimist. As they say, either you end up with a good outcome or you're proved right. So it's always safe to be pessimistic and easier, I would say, to raise questions and say. But anyhow, I think the substantive part was addressed. I think this question is really very big, but I'm just going to leave you with a certain history of this organization, which explains why it was consciously not kept as part of the UN structures, and why that may not necessarily be the best direction to go. And this actually links back to the whole, ideology which drives where this organization is placed. So you don't want to mix up the economics and the politics, right? This is the neoliberal sort of framework where you say any shadow of politics is not good for this organization because this is, the free market, the forces of the market, etc. And international organizations have a fascinating sort of, thought process behind the location of the headquarters, as I'm sure many people know. I mean, there was this whole literature on what happened when the IMF and the World Bank became part of the Washington trio, where the US Treasury was also in the same city. So initially, when the ITO was envisaged, it was meant to be a specialized agency of the United Nations because it was the ECOSOC that had commissioned the original negotiations in 1940s. But by the time of the WTO, there was this clear sort of understanding that we need to keep the WTO as a free market entity, very, very distant from the United Nations and what was happening there in terms of the political discourses. So I think there is a conscious reason why you do not find the WTO in the organigram of the United Nations, where the specialized. So IMF and World Bank are specialized agencies, but the WTO is not. So that's in very brief. And also inclusion actually is not an issue in the WTO. The problem is just the opposite, because one of the reasons why the WTO says we can't come up with solutions is because of the consensus principle, because anybody can block really what is happening, in terms of decision making coming out of the ministerial conferences. So I think we have to look for solutions elsewhere. And I know this is a very short sort of response, but maybe we can speak bilaterally. And just one small word on Pooja's question, which is fascinating because you bring up the concept of environmental goods and services. And this was really an issue which was initially seen to be the win-win-win situation in WTO. So is trade opposed to environment? Usually is, but at least when we are talking about environmental goods, it's not, right? So this is a win for everybody. And yet when you see the EGS negotiations, they basically got nowhere. They are stranded now, even after getting into the plurilateral track, the environmental goods and services. And this is why I think what's happening in trade also links back to the fact that the dispute resolution system is not working, that the appellate body is not there. The EU has come up with the trade legislations, which are sustainability legislations, right? You've heard of the CBAM, the border adjustment mechanisms, and also the EU deforestation regulations, all of which are going to throw up a whole lot of concerns for the developing countries who are exporting to the European market, but are not going to get entry very soon because of sustainability concerns, and there is nowhere to go to. I mean, that's basically the end of the story. So let me stop.
Thank you. And Dr. Kathuria, any last words from your
I
side?
just wanted to say not so much for Nutan, but for the benefit of the students and the young researchers sitting here. I think it's important to realize, I mean, what Professor Murthy, I completely agree with. Montaigne had once said about gradualism and economic policy in India. It will work best rather than big bang reforms. And I think for the UN, also gradualism incrementalism is probably the best way to go. I remember Yes Prime Minister used to say about the UN, UN is the body for the expression of international hatred. More realistically, I think for young students, I would say for young researchers, I would say that there's a thin line between pragmatism and cynicism. And I've now become a cynic, as most people do when they work if you're working on institutions, you're probably likely to become a cynic. But one of the things that India doesn't do well, and of course, Ambassador will know much better, in my experience in these negotiations, etc., is that we are often caught off guard as being underprepared also. And I think for young researchers, it's important to, of course, not be cynical, but also try and be pragmatic and less idealistic. And when I say less idealistic, I say that, one organization is unlikely to solve the global problems, right? So there are organizations which are made for specific things, and they obviously evolve. What WTO was and what it's likely to become is probably completely different. There was no linkages with society, and there was no linkages with environment. There was no linkages with labor. I can't see WTO progressing without these linkages now, but they didn't exist in the past. And if you look at the free trade agreements that are now gold standard, they all have standards linked with trade. So what I'm sort of advising from the vantage point of the experience is that be prepared, don't be cynical, but pragmatic. And idealism is okay, but in negotiation, it doesn't get you very far.
On the issue of trade within the UN system. So Archana, we also have UNCTAD. Yeah, so there is a trade and development agenda within the UN framework. And there is a mandate that UN has on trade, and which is specifically linked to development. But it doesn't have so much of a negotiating mandate. And in a way, it has become a sort of subservient to WTO's agenda, objectives, aims, etc., which is very sad. So the point here is, because that is where you have interlinkages between development and trade. It is a developing country agenda, and that should get that should be pushed to the foreground, not UNCTAD as such, but trade and development within the UN system. And but that we don't see. As you said, there is nothing on trade in the declaration on future generations and in the outcome documents, as I also mentioned in the morning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, speakers, for sharing your perspective on the various aspects of transforming global governance. I hope it has been an enriching experience for the participants as well. Thank you for engaging in the discussion. I kindly request everyone to join us at the foray for lunch.